My family called me nothing at my father's 70th birthday party, saying I'd never achieved anything meaningful in my legal career. They didn't know that while they were cutting cake, I was being considered for the most prestigious judicial appointment in the country. When Supreme Court Justice Margaret Chen walked into that same country club 3 weeks later and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Chief Justice Rebecca Thompson," my mother's face went white. The nothing they'd humiliated was now the youngest Chief Justice in Supreme Court history, and my brother's biggest case was coming before my court. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was wrong when my mother, Katherine Thompson, greeted me at the Riverside Country Club wearing her most expensive jewelry and a smile that felt like ice. I'd just driven 4 hours from the federal courthouse in San Francisco, my judicial robe still hanging in the back seat, my briefcase filled with opinions I'd been drafting for landmark civil rights cases. It was my father's 70th birthday celebration, and for once, I thought my family might actually acknowledge what I'd accomplished. But let me tell you how a family can destroy your confidence in a single evening, how they can make you question everything you've worked for, only to discover that while they were calling you worthless, you were actually making history. This is the story of how I went from being the family embarrassment to presiding over the highest court in the land, and how sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up kneeling before your gavel. The Thompson family had dominated Boston's legal and business elite for 4 generations. My grandfather had been a founding partner at Thompson Whitman & Associates, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms on the East Coast. My father, William, had expanded the firm's influence into international mergers and acquisitions, making him a powerhouse in corporate America. My older brother, Marcus, had followed the family blueprint perfectly: Harvard Law School, Supreme Court clerkship, and now senior partner at the family firm, representing Fortune 500 companies in billion-dollar deals. I was supposed to be next in line, the daughter who would cement the Thompson legacy in corporate law. Instead, I'd chosen what they saw as professional suicide. While Marcus was negotiating hostile takeovers, I was defending death row inmates. While he was attending exclusive corporate retreats, I was working pro bono cases in inner-city legal clinics. For 12 years, I'd built a reputation as a fierce advocate for civil rights and social justice, eventually earning appointment to the federal bench where I'd been writing opinions that legal scholars called groundbreaking. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I was coming to the celebration with news that would change everything. Just 48 hours earlier, I'd received a call that still made my hands shake when I thought about it. White House Chief of Staff David Harrison himself had delivered the message. President Martinez was nominating me for Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. At 38, I would be the youngest Chief Justice in American history, overseeing constitutional decisions that would shape the nation for generations. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus, their golden boy, was currently arguing a major antitrust case that would likely come before the Supreme Court within the year. But I hadn't come home to gloat. I'd come hoping that maybe, finally, they'd see that my path had meaning too. The Riverside Country Club gleamed with understated elegance that screamed old money and older prejudices. Through the windows of the main ballroom, I could see the familiar crowd: corporate executives, federal judges, senators, and Supreme Judicial Court justices. This was where I'd grown up feeling like an outsider, the daughter who preferred constitutional law textbooks to country club tennis, who dreamed of fighting for justice instead of maximizing billable hours. My mother had made her disappointment crystal clear from the beginning. "Rebecca, civil rights law is a dead end," she'd said when I started taking pro bono cases. "You're brilliant enough to make real money, to build something that matters. Why waste your talents on people who can't even pay you?" My father had been more subtle but equally disapproving, introducing me to colleagues as "our daughter who works in public service," with the same tone he might use to say "our daughter who collects garbage." Marcus had been the most cutting. "Face it, Becca," he'd said during our last family dinner 2 years ago, "you chose the easy path. It's easier to feel righteous than to actually succeed in competitive law. When you're ready to practice real law, the family firm will always be here." But standing in that country club lobby, wearing the conservative black dress I'd chosen specifically to blend in, I knew something they didn't. I hadn't chosen the easy path. I'd chosen the most demanding one possible, and in 3 days, the entire legal world would know exactly what Rebecca Thompson had accomplished. Marcus intercepted me before I could reach the main ballroom, his expression colder than a January morning in Boston. He looked immaculate in his custom-tailored tuxedo, every inch the successful corporate attorney. But his eyes held something I'd never seen before, genuine hostility. "Rebecca." "You're late," he said, blocking my path toward the celebration. "Traffic was heavy coming from the city," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I brought Dad a gift from that antique shop he loves." He didn't move aside. Instead, he crossed his arms and lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. "We need to talk before you go in there. The family has made some decisions about tonight." My stomach dropped. In the Thompson household, family decisions made without me were never good news. Through the ballroom doors, I could hear the sounds of celebration. Laughter, clinking glasses, the gentle hum of 200 guests enjoying themselves. But Marcus's tone cut through it all like a blade. "What kind of decisions?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Look, Becca, tonight is about Dad's legacy, about celebrating what our family has built in this city. We've worked too hard to establish our reputation to have it complicated by your career choices." He pulled out his phone and showed me the evening's program. There, under Celebrating the Thompson Legacy, were photos and biographies of every family member, except me. "You see this?" he continued, pointing to his own entry. "Partner at Thompson, Whitman & Associates, Harvard Law Review. Argued 12 cases before the Supreme Court. And then there's Mom's philanthropy work, Dad's business achievements. What would we put for you? Defends criminals and works for free?" I stared at the program, my hands beginning to shake. "Marcus, I'm a federal judge. I've written opinions that have been cited by who? Liberal activists? Law school professors who've never practiced real law?" His voice grew louder, and I could see guests in the ballroom starting to turn and look through the glass doors. "You think sitting on some district court bench makes you important? You think your little civil rights cases matter to anyone who counts?" My father appeared behind Marcus, his face stern and disappointed. William Thompson had always been a man who commanded respect in every room he entered. Tonight, he looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving. "Rebecca, we need to discuss your situation," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in corporate law. "This family has spent generations building credibility in the legal community. We can't have that undermined by association with controversial judicial activism." "Dad, what are you talking about? I'm not controversial." "Aren't you?" My mother appeared, flanked by my aunts and uncles. Katherine Thompson looked stunning in her emerald evening gown, every inch the society matriarch. "That abortion rights opinion you wrote last month? That criminal justice reform piece? Do you have any idea how many phone calls we've received from colleagues expressing their concerns about your judicial philosophy?" The accusations came rapid fire now, a coordinated assault that felt rehearsed. My Uncle Charles stepped forward, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Your cousin Amanda just made partner at Skadden. Your cousin Robert closed a $2 billion merger last week. And what do we tell people when they ask about Rebecca? That she's the bleeding heart who writes opinions that make corporate law more difficult?" "I'm interpreting the Constitution," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm protecting people's rights. I'm doing what judges are supposed to do." "What you're supposed to do," Marcus interrupted, "is support your family's interests, not undermine them with your liberal agenda. Every opinion you write makes it harder for legitimate lawyers to serve their clients effectively." My mother stepped closer, her eyes cold as winter. "Rebecca, we've made a decision. For tonight, and going forward, we think it's best if your judicial career isn't emphasized in family discussions. We're asking you to keep a low profile, to not mention your cases or your court when you speak with our guests." You're asking me to hide what I do for a living? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We're asking you to consider the family's reputation, my father said firmly. This is bigger than your individual choices, Rebecca. This is about the Thompson name. About everything we've built. The sounds of the birthday celebration continued just yards away, but I felt completely isolated. Standing there in my conservative black dress, holding a gift for a man who was ashamed to claim my achievements as his daughters. The birthday celebration became a 3-hour nightmare of subtle humiliation and deliberate exclusion. My family had clearly briefed their guests beforehand, because every conversation followed the same painful pattern. When longtime family friends asked about my career, there would be an awkward pause before someone quickly changed the subject to Marcus's latest corporate victory or my father's business achievements. Judge Patricia Morrison, whom I'd known since childhood and who had always been supportive of my career, approached me during cocktail hour with obvious confusion. "Rebecca, dear, I was just speaking with your mother about your recent opinions. She seemed unfamiliar with your work on the federal bench. Is everything all right?" Before I could answer, my mother appeared beside us with a forced smile. "Patricia, you simply must hear about Marcus's recent Supreme Court argument. It was absolutely brilliant. He represented 3 Fortune 500 companies in a landmark antitrust case. The message was clear. My judicial work wasn't worth discussing, but Marcus's corporate law achievements were worthy of celebration. The worst moment came during my father's toast. William Thompson stood before 200 of Boston's most influential legal and business leaders, thanking them for celebrating his legacy. He spoke proudly about building the family law firm, about Marcus's partnership and recent courtroom victories, about my mother's charitable work with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Then he paused, looked directly at me, and said, "And of course, we're grateful that all our children have found their own paths in life, even if some of those paths are different from what we might have traditionally expected from the Thompson family." The room erupted in polite applause, but I felt like I'd been slapped. In a room full of federal judges, Supreme Judicial Court justices, and legal scholars, my father had just publicly dismissed my judicial career as a disappointment that needed to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Senator Margaret Walsh, who had been following my civil rights opinions with interest, cornered me later near the dessert table. "Rebecca, I have to ask, your family seems remarkably modest about your achievements on the federal bench. I've been very impressed with your constitutional scholarship. Why haven't they mentioned your judicial work tonight?" I started to explain, but Marcus appeared like he'd been monitoring my conversations all evening. "Senator Walsh, you should really hear about our father's impact on international corporate law. Did you know he pioneered several merger strategies that are now standard practice?" It became a pattern that repeated throughout the night. Every time someone tried to discuss my judicial career, a family member would redirect the conversation to more appropriate topics. I was effectively invisible at my own father's birthday party, despite being the only federal judge in the room. The cruelest moment came when Judge Robert Sterling, a respected state court judge, approached our family group during dinner. "William, you must be incredibly proud of Rebecca's work on constitutional law. Her recent opinion on Fourth Amendment protections was masterful. It's already being cited by courts across the country." My father looked uncomfortable, but Marcus jumped in immediately. "Judge Sterling, that's very kind, but we prefer to focus on the family's business achievements. Rebecca's work is, well, it's quite different from the Thompson family's traditional legal practice." Judge Sterling looked confused and slightly offended. "Different? She's a federal judge writing constitutional law. That's the highest form of legal scholarship." "Of course," my mother said smoothly, "but we've always been more focused on practical legal solutions that serve real business needs. Rebecca's work is more theoretical." I wanted to disappear. In front of my judicial colleagues, my own family was dismissing my constitutional opinions as irrelevant theory, suggesting that real law happened in corporate boardrooms, not federal courtrooms. By the end of the evening, I felt completely erased. The federal judge, who had spent years writing opinions that protected civil rights and shaped constitutional law, had been reduced to the family embarrassment, whose career was too shameful to acknowledge in public. For weeks after the birthday humiliation, I tried everything I could think of to rebuild my standing with my family and prove the value of my judicial work. I sent them copies of legal journals that had featured my constitutional opinions, hoping they might finally understand the significance of what I'd been accomplishing. I forwarded articles from Harvard Law Review and Yale Law Journal that cited my reasoning in landmark civil rights cases. Every gesture was met with polite indifference or outright dismissal. My mother returned my law journal articles with a note that read, "Dear Rebecca, while I'm sure these publications are meaningful to you, we receive so many legal materials through your father's firm that we simply don't have time to review academic pieces. Perhaps you could send us updates when you're involved in something more commercially relevant." I tried reaching out to legal colleagues who knew my family, hoping they might help bridge the gap between my judicial achievements and my family's understanding. Judge Elizabeth Harper, who had served with my father on several Bar Association committees, agreed to speak with him about my work. The conversation backfired spectacularly. Judge Harper later told me that my father had listened politely, then responded, "Elizabeth, I appreciate Rebecca's dedication, but you have to understand our position. Marcus represents clients in billion-dollar transactions that affect thousands of jobs and entire industries. Rebecca's work, while I'm sure it's well-intentioned, deals with individual cases that have limited practical impact. We're simply focused on different scales of influence." I decided to invite my family to observe oral arguments in my courtroom, thinking that seeing me in action might help them understand the gravity and complexity of federal judicial work. I was hearing a major environmental law case that would affect regulatory policy across 6 states, with implications for both corporate interests and environmental protection. Marcus agreed to attend, but only after I emphasized the business implications of the case. He sat in the gallery for 2 hours, watching me manage complex constitutional questions, guide legal arguments, and demonstrate the judicial temperament that had earned me respect throughout the federal system. Afterward, his assessment was devastating. "Becca, I watched you spend 2 hours listening to lawyers argue about regulations that will probably be overturned on appeal anyway. In the same time, I closed a merger that will create 1,200 jobs and generate $40 million in tax revenue. I don't understand how you can call what you do more important than what I do." My most desperate attempt came when I tried to explain the nomination process to my father. I hinted that there might be significant career developments ahead, that my judicial work was gaining national attention in ways that could reflect positively on the Thompson family name. His response crushed any remaining hope I had for understanding. "Rebecca, if you're talking about appellate court nominations, you need to be realistic about your chances. Your opinions are too liberal, too controversial. Conservative judicial appointments are what matter in the current political climate. Even if you were nominated for something higher, it would probably create more negative attention than positive recognition for our family." The irony was excruciating. My father was lecturing me about political realities, while being completely ignorant of the actual political realities surrounding my career. He was dismissing possibilities that were already set in motion, rejecting achievements that had already been recognized at the highest levels of government. I began to question everything I'd worked toward. Late at night in my chambers, surrounded by constitutional law books and pending case files, I wondered if my family was right. Maybe federal judicial work was just an academic exercise removed from real-world impact. Maybe I had chosen idealism over practical influence. The self-doubt crept in slowly but persistently. When law clerks praised my reasoning in complex cases, I wondered if they were just being polite. When legal scholars cited my opinions, I questioned whether academic attention translated to meaningful change. When colleagues spoke respectfully about my judicial philosophy, I second-guessed whether respect within the federal court system actually mattered in the broader world. By spring, I had almost convinced myself that my family's assessment was correct. I was an idealistic judge writing theoretical opinions that impressed academics but had little real-world significance. The breakthrough came on a sweltering August afternoon when I was reviewing briefs in my chambers. There was a gentle knock on my door, and my clerk announced that someone was requesting an urgent meeting. a young woman who claimed to have a personal connection to one of my recent opinions. Maria Santos entered my chambers hesitantly, clutching a worn manila folder against her chest. She was probably in her early 20s, professionally dressed but clearly nervous. I recognized her name from a case I'd decided 6 months earlier, but seeing her in person brought the human reality of judicial work into sharp focus. Your Honor, I hope you don't mind me coming here directly. I tried to reach you through normal channels, but I needed to thank you personally for what you did. I gestured for her to sit down, curious about what had brought her to my office. Please, tell me what this is about. The Garcia versus Immigration Services case, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You probably handle so many cases that you don't remember the details, but your opinion saved my family's life. The memory came flooding back. It had been a complex immigration case involving a family facing deportation, despite having followed all legal procedures correctly. The government had argued that a minor paperwork error invalidated their entire application. I'd written a detailed opinion about due process rights and the constitutional principle that technical errors shouldn't destroy legitimate claims when individuals had acted in good faith. I remember the case, I said softly, but tell me what it meant to you personally. Maria opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. A family of 6, standing in front of a small house, everyone smiling at the camera. This is my family. My parents brought us here when I was 8 years old. They did everything legally, followed every rule, paid every fee. But there was one form where they checked the wrong box. A mistake their lawyers should have caught. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. The immigration court said that mistake invalidated everything. 15 years of legal residency, my father's business, my younger siblings' education, all of it was going to be taken away because of one checkbox on one form. I leaned forward, remembering the hours I'd spent researching the constitutional implications of that case. Your lawyer appealed to federal court. Yes, and the case came to you. Your Honor, I need you to understand what your decision meant. When you ruled that good faith compliance with immigration law couldn't be destroyed by technical errors, you didn't just save one family. You created precedent that's protecting thousands of families across the country. She pulled out more documents from her folder, letters, newspaper clippings, legal briefs. Immigration lawyers are calling your opinion the Santos Standard now. It's being cited in cases from Texas to New York. My own lawyer says it's changed how federal courts handle immigration due process entirely. I stared at the materials she'd brought, stunned by the scope of impact I hadn't fully realized. Maria, I had no idea the opinion was being applied so broadly. That's not all, she continued, her eyes bright with emotion. Because of your ruling, my little brother graduated valedictorian from his high school class last month. My sister just started her freshman year at MIT. My father's construction business now employs 12 people. None of that would exist if you hadn't seen past the government's technical argument to the constitutional principle underneath. She reached into her folder one more time and pulled out a graduation program. This is from my law school graduation ceremony last week. I'm starting as a public defender next month, working specifically on immigration cases. Your opinion didn't just save my family, it inspired my entire career path. The weight of her words hit me like lightning. For months, my family had convinced me that my judicial work was theoretical, irrelevant, disconnected from real-world impact. But here was living proof that constitutional law mattered in the most fundamental way possible. My reasoning in one case had changed legal precedent across the federal system, and was now protecting thousands of families from deportation. Maria, I don't know what to say. Thank you for coming here, for showing me this. No, Your Honor, thank you. Thank you for seeing us as human beings, not just case numbers. Thank you for understanding that the Constitution protects everyone, not just people who can afford perfect lawyers. Thank you for proving that federal judges can change the world, one opinion at a time. After she left, I sat in my chambers staring at the documents she'd given me. My family's narrative crumbled completely in that moment. I wasn't writing theoretical opinions for academic journals. I was crafting constitutional precedent that would protect vulnerable people for generations. I wasn't removed from real-world impact. I was creating the legal framework that shaped how democracy worked for millions of Americans. The federal judge who had been dismissed as irrelevant was actually wielding more influence than all of my family's corporate law work combined. And they had no idea. Maria's visit ignited something that had been dormant for months. That evening, I sat in my chambers with a legal pad and began documenting every case I'd decided, every opinion I'd written, every constitutional principle I'd helped establish. For the first time since my father's birthday party, I wasn't dwelling on my family's rejection. I was cataloging my actual judicial impact, the real influence I'd had on American law. I started reaching out to legal scholars, civil rights organizations, and other federal judges who had cited my work. The conversations were revelatory. Professor Janet Williams from Georgetown Law School told me about how my Fourth Amendment opinions were being taught in constitutional law classes across the country. Judge Thompson, your reasoning in digital privacy cases is reshaping how we understand constitutional protections in the modern era. Law students are writing dissertations analyzing your judicial philosophy. The American Civil Liberties Union sent me a detailed report showing how my opinions had been cited in over 200 federal cases across the nation. My reasoning on due process rights, equal protection clauses, and First Amendment freedoms was being used by judges from California to Maine to protect constitutional rights in ways I'd never imagined. But the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source. Chief Judge Patricia Rodriguez of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals called my chambers personally to discuss a case she was hearing. Rebecca, I need to ask you about the constitutional framework you established in Thompson v. State Department. We're applying your reasoning to a case involving religious freedom and government overreach. Your opinion is becoming the gold standard for balancing individual rights against government interests. As I compiled this evidence, a clearer picture emerged. My family saw federal judicial work as academic and irrelevant, but the reality was that I'd been operating at the highest level of constitutional interpretation, crafting legal precedents that would influence American law for decades. The opinions they dismissed as theoretical were being cited by the Supreme Court itself. I began organizing case files that told a different story than the one my family had spread. Letters from the Department of Justice acknowledging that my criminal justice opinions had influenced federal prosecution guidelines. Communications from state attorneys general explaining how my constitutional interpretations had shaped their legal strategies. Documentation from law schools showing that my judicial reasoning was being studied as model examples of constitutional scholarship. More importantly, I discovered that my impact extended far beyond individual cases. The National Association of Federal Judges had quietly been circulating my opinions as examples of excellent judicial writing. The Federal Judicial Conference had adopted procedural reforms based on recommendations I'd made in several administrative law cases. My work wasn't just influencing current legal practice, it was shaping how the federal court system operated. I found letters from other federal judges describing specific cases where my constitutional reasoning had guided their decisions. Judge Michael Chen from the Eastern District of Texas wrote, "Your analysis of 14th Amendment protections in marginalized communities has revolutionized how I approach civil rights cases. Your judicial philosophy combines rigorous constitutional interpretation with deep understanding of real-world consequences." But the most significant discovery came when I researched how often my opinions were being cited by the Supreme Court itself. A legal database search revealed that in the past year alone, Supreme Court justices had referenced my constitutional reasoning in 12 different cases. My interpretations of due process, equal protection, and constitutional rights were being incorporated into the highest court's decision-making process. The evidence was overwhelming. While my family had been dismissing my work as irrelevant activism, I'd actually been crafting constitutional law that was influencing the entire federal judicial system. The theoretical opinions they mocked were being used by the Supreme Court to decide cases that affected millions of Americans. I wasn't just a successful federal judge. I was someone whose constitutional scholarship was shaping American jurisprudence at the highest levels. And they had no idea that the woman they'd humiliated at a birthday party was already being watched by the most powerful legal minds in the country. The breakthrough I'd been searching for came from the most unexpected place: my late grandmother's study. Grandmama Eleanor, my mother's mother, had passed away 2 months after my father's birthday humiliation. She'd been the only family member who'd ever seemed genuinely interested in my judicial work, though she'd always been quiet about it in front of the rest of the family. Her townhouse had been sitting untouched while the family sorted through her estate. When my cousin offered me the chance to collect any personal mementos before they sold the property, I almost declined. But something drew me back to the brownstone where I'd spent childhood afternoons listening to her stories about fighting for women's rights in the 1960s. In her mahogany-paneled study, behind rows of first-edition law books and civil rights memoirs, I found a locked filing cabinet I'd never noticed before. The key was in an envelope marked "For Rebecca," in my grandmother's elegant handwriting, tucked inside her copy of A Room of One's Own. Inside were documents that took my breath away. My grandmother had been quietly collecting evidence of my judicial impact for years. She had copies of law review articles analyzing my constitutional opinions. She'd saved newspaper clippings from legal publications that highlighted my groundbreaking work on digital privacy rights. She'd even kept correspondence from Supreme Court clerks who had cited my reasoning in their research memos. But the most shocking discovery was a thick folder labeled "The Truth About Rebecca." Inside were printed emails, letters, and documents that revealed the full scope of how my family had been deliberately hiding my achievements. And why? There was an email chain between my mother and father from just 3 months before my father's birthday party. "Bill, Rebecca's name came up at the partners' dinner last night. Judge Morrison was praising her constitutional scholarship, saying she's being considered for, quote, significant advancement. We need to be more careful about how we handle her career. If she gets promoted to appellate court, it could overshadow Marcus's partnership announcement." Another email, this one from Marcus to my father, was even more damning. "Dad, I just heard from contacts at the Justice Department that Rebecca might be on a shortlist for something major. We can't let her judicial activism reflect poorly on the firm. Our corporate clients are already nervous about liberal federal judges. Having one in the family could cost us accounts." But the most devastating find was a letter my mother had written to several prominent Boston social figures, asking them to avoid mentioning my judicial work at social gatherings. She'd specifically requested that they, quote, redirect conversations about judicial appointments toward more traditional legal achievements to avoid drawing attention to what she called my problematic judicial philosophy. My grandmother had also discovered something I'd never known. My family had been actively working to prevent recognition of my achievements. They'd declined invitations to judicial ceremonies honoring my work. They'd refused interviews when legal publications wanted to profile successful legal families. My father had even asked his alma mater not to include my judicial service in their alumni magazine features about the Thompson family. At the bottom of the cabinet was a letter from my grandmother, written in her shaking handwriting just weeks before she died. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then they've succeeded in making you doubt yourself again. But I've been watching, I've been researching, and I know the truth. Your family isn't just embarrassed by your success, they're terrified of it. They live in a world where power comes from money and corporate influence. But you wield a different kind of power, constitutional authority that shapes the rights of every American citizen. They can't control that power, so they've tried to diminish it. I've saved everything they tried to hide. Every article praising your judicial scholarship, every citation of your constitutional reasoning, every proof that you are extraordinary. The appointment is coming, Rebecca. I've heard whispers through old friends at the Justice Department. When it comes, show them exactly who Rebecca Thompson really is. You haven't been writing opinions. You've been writing history. Don't let them erase that truth." Armed with my grandmother's evidence, I began digging deeper into my family's systematic campaign to hide my judicial achievements. What I discovered was more calculated and deliberate than I could have imagined. They hadn't just been embarrassed by my constitutional work. They'd been actively sabotaging my reputation to protect their own business interests. I reached out to legal colleagues and former classmates, asking careful questions about what they'd heard regarding my family's view of my judicial career. The responses painted a disturbing picture. Professor David Kim from Harvard Law School admitted he'd always wondered why my family never attended judicial conferences or ceremonies honoring my work. "Rebecca, your parents were invited to speak at the Federal Judicial Conference about raising children who serve the legal profession. They declined without explanation. Most families would consider that the honor of a lifetime." The pattern became clear. My family had systematically refused opportunities to be associated with my judicial success while simultaneously promoting Marcus's corporate achievements at every possible venue. I contacted the Boston Bar Association, which had tried multiple times to feature the Thompson family in their publications about legal dynasties. The editor, Sarah Mitchell, revealed something shocking. Judge Thompson, your father specifically requested that any family profiles focus exclusively on the firm's corporate practice. He said judicial work wasn't representative of the family's core legal philosophy. But the smoking gun came when I obtained email records through a Freedom of Information Act request related to judicial appointment processes. Marcus had been corresponding with influential legal organizations, subtly undermining my reputation by suggesting that my liberal judicial activism didn't represent mainstream legal thinking. In one particularly damaging email to the Federalist Society, Marcus had written, "While I respect my sister's right to her judicial philosophy, I want to make clear that her constitutional interpretations don't reflect the Thompson family's approach to legal practice. We believe in strict constitutional construction and business-friendly judicial reasoning." More shocking still was the discovery that my father had been actively lobbying against my inclusion in prestigious legal organizations. Through a contact at the American Law Institute, I learned that my father had quietly opposed my nomination for membership, claiming that my activist judicial opinions would be controversial and damage the organization's reputation for balanced legal scholarship. The most devastating revelation came from an unlikely source, Judge Margaret Chen herself, who would later play such a crucial role in my vindication. When I mentioned my family's reaction to my judicial work during a casual conversation, she revealed something that stunned me. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something that's been troubling me. Your brother Marcus approached me at a legal conference last year. He asked me not to mention your name when discussing promising federal judges, because he said your family preferred to keep your judicial work separate from family business considerations. I found it very odd at the time." Judge Chen continued. "What made it stranger was that he specifically asked me to avoid discussing your constitutional scholarship in legal circles where your family might have business interests. He made it sound like your judicial philosophy was somehow damaging to their professional relationships." The final piece of evidence came from the most unexpected source, my mother's former law school roommate, now a prominent legal recruiter. She revealed that my parents had been quietly discouraging law firms from recruiting me for high-profile positions, claiming that my judicial activism made me a risky choice for firms with corporate clients. "Your mother told me that you were too idealistic for serious legal practice," she said during our phone conversation. She suggested that your constitutional work was more suited to academic settings than real-world legal applications. I always found that strange, given your reputation for brilliant judicial reasoning. The pattern was unmistakable. My family hadn't just been hiding my achievements, they'd been actively working to limit my opportunities and influence. They were terrified that my constitutional authority would expose the moral bankruptcy of their corporate-focused worldview. I realized that my grandmother's prediction had been right. The appointment was coming, and when it did, there would be no way for my family to hide the truth anymore. The question was, how would I use the power that was about to be handed to me? The call came on a crisp September morning while I was reviewing constitutional briefs in my chambers. White House Chief of Staff David Harrison was on the line, his voice carrying the weight of history. "Judge Thompson, the President has made his decision. You're his nominee for Chief Justice of the United States. The announcement will be made this afternoon, but we wanted you to be the first to know. You're about to become the youngest Chief Justice in Supreme Court history." I sat in stunned silence, then managed to respond. "Thank you, sir. I'm deeply honored by the President's confidence." "Rebecca, this isn't just about confidence. Your constitutional scholarship has been studied by every member of the current court. Your judicial philosophy represents the future of American jurisprudence. You've earned this." The irony was overwhelming. While my family had been systematically hiding my achievements and undermining my reputation, the President of the United States had been watching my judicial work and considering me for the highest legal position in the country. The news broke 2 hours later. Every major media outlet led with the story. President nominates 38-year-old Rebecca Thompson as Chief Justice. The coverage was extensive, detailing my groundbreaking constitutional opinions, my rapid rise through the federal judiciary, and my reputation as one of the most brilliant legal minds of her generation. My phone exploded with congratulatory calls. Supreme Court justices, federal judges, law school deans, civil rights leaders, all calling to express their excitement and support. But the calls I was most curious about never came. My family remained completely silent. The real moment of vindication came 3 weeks later. I was attending a legal conference at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where my family had humiliated me at my father's birthday party. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through the same ballroom where they'd dismissed my judicial career as irrelevant. But the universe had one more surprise in store. Just as the conference was ending, my aide approached with an urgent message. Chief Justice Designate Thompson, there's a situation in the main dining room. Your family is having dinner here tonight, and they've requested an immediate meeting with you. Supreme Court Justice Margaret Chen is with them. The walk to the dining room felt surreal. I entered to find my entire family seated around the same table where they'd celebrated my father's birthday 9 months earlier. But now Justice Chen stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding immediate respect from everyone in the room. Nakretai called Eoprel. Justice Chen stepped forward with a formal smile. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Chief Justice Designate Rebecca Thompson. It's an honor to be here with someone who will soon lead the highest court in our nation. The silence in the room was deafening. My father's face went white as he realized the full implications of what was happening. My mother looked like she might faint. Marcus, who had spent years undermining my judicial work, sat frozen in his chair as Justice Chen continued. I have to say, the Thompson family should be incredibly proud. Rebecca's constitutional scholarship is already being called transformative by legal historians. Her judicial philosophy will shape American law for generations to come. Justice Chen turned to address my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, you've raised a daughter who will be remembered alongside Chief Justices Marshall and Warren as one of the great constitutional minds in American history. The legal community is in awe of her achievements. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. We had no idea the nomination was. We didn't realize. Of course you're modest about her success, Justice Chen replied graciously, but Rebecca's appointment represents the pinnacle of judicial achievement. She'll be presiding over cases that will define constitutional rights for the next century. For the first time in my life, my family had no words. None of them did. The woman they'd called nothing was about to become the most powerful judge in America. 6 months later, I stood in the Supreme Court chamber, wearing the traditional black robes of the Chief Justice, presiding over oral arguments in a landmark constitutional case that would reshape American civil rights law for generations. As the youngest Chief Justice in U.S. history, I was leading discussions on constitutional interpretation that would influence democracy itself. The same legal reasoning my family had dismissed as was now the foundation for the highest court's decision-making process. The transformation hadn't just been professional. It had been profoundly personal. The woman who had once questioned her worth in a country club dining room was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true judicial authority comes not from family approval but from unwavering commitment to constitutional principles and the courage to protect the rights of all Americans. My family had eventually reached out, of course. It started with formal congratulations after my confirmation, then awkward invitations to family events, where they could now proudly introduce me as Chief Justice Rebecca Thompson. They wanted to reconcile, to celebrate this incredible achievement together, and share in the prestige that came with having the Chief Justice as a family member. I met with them once, in my new chambers at the Supreme Court. They came prepared with elaborate apologies and explanations. My mother talked about how she'd always known I was destined for greatness. My father mentioned displaying my official Chief Justice portrait in the law firm lobby. Marcus claimed he'd always believed in my judicial philosophy but had been protecting me from political pressures that might have hindered my career advancement. I listened politely, then shared something they didn't expect. I'd established the Eleanor Thompson Foundation for Constitutional Education, named after my grandmother. The foundation provided legal education for underserved communities, funded scholarships for first-generation law students, and created programs teaching constitutional rights to young people whose voices had been systematically silenced. This is my real legacy, I told them, not corporate mergers or billable hours, but ensuring that every American understands their constitutional rights and has access to justice. Grandmama understood that law is about protecting people, not just protecting profits. I didn't cut them off completely, but I didn't pretend that their sudden pride meant anything either. They'd revealed their true values when they thought I was powerless, and that knowledge had freed me from needing their validation or acceptance. The greatest satisfaction came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the young woman whose immigration case had opened my eyes to my judicial impact, was now working as a civil rights attorney. During her first appearance before the Supreme Court, she looked up at me in the Chief Justice's chair and smiled with recognition and gratitude. "Chief Justice Thompson," she said, during oral arguments, "the constitutional framework you established as a federal judge continues to protect vulnerable communities across this nation. Your judicial philosophy of compassionate constitutionalism has become the gold standard for protecting individual rights while maintaining legal precedent." My chamber's walls now displayed photos from constitutional law conferences around the world, letters from presidents and prime ministers, and thank you notes from ordinary Americans whose rights had been protected by opinions I'd written. But the centerpiece was still my grandmother's letter, framed next to a photo of us together when I was 16, both of us holding copies of the Constitution, she with her well-worn copy from her civil rights activism days, me with my pristine law school edition. The Supreme Court had become my true family home, filled with brilliant legal minds who understood that constitutional interpretation isn't about political ideology, but about protecting the fundamental rights that define American democracy. Every morning I walked past the portraits of previous Chief Justices who had shaped constitutional law throughout history, knowing that someday my portrait would hang there too. Not because of my family connections or social status, but because I had earned my place through dedication to justice and the courage to defend constitutional principles even when they were unpopular. The woman who had been called nothing at her father's birthday party had become the person who now shaped constitutional law for the most powerful democracy on earth. And the best part? I'd done it by staying true to my values and refusing to let anyone else define the limits of my judicial impact. My name is Chief Justice Rebecca Thompson, and I am exactly who I was always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.